Kafka. Kafka. Is that your real name? Why shouldn't it be?
There are people watching.
In Kafka's courtroom, you're not just presumed innocent until proven guilty. You're presumed guilty even after proven innocent, and then sentenced for not understanding why. Franz Kafka believed existence operates like a courtroom where the verdict precedes the accusation. He died in 1924, obscure, unpublished in any major way, asking his closest friend to burn what remained of his manuscripts. Well, what a friend he had. Instead of adhering to Kafka's final demand, his friend went on to publish those manuscripts. With friends like this, who needs enemies? The strange irony is that the man who felt perpetually condemned is now revered as a pioneer in literature, and his work is firmly etched in literary culture. So how does a work survive its author, despite its author? How does one, being under trial since infancy, never see their final verdict? To understand that we have to return to the beginning of an infant who felt he was on trial for being alive. Franz Kafka was born on July 3, 1883 in Prague, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. If you are confused, you're not the only one. I haven't heard of this empire either. Perhaps there needs to be a posthumous segment of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He entered a world layered with tension, and that is self-explanatory when you understand that he was a German-speaking Jew. So you can tell from the start that he belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. The attempt to, at the very least, invoke a sense of harmony amidst the all-encompassing tension resulting from a time-sensitive futility would come to be the hallmark of Kafka's work. His family moved repeatedly during his early childhood, shifting homes 5 times within his first 6 years. He was the eldest child, but 2 younger brothers died in infancy, and so he grew up largely among sisters who would later perish in the Holocaust. His father, Hermann Kafka, was a self-made merchant who ruled the household with authority that bordered on intimidation. His mother, Julie, was affectionate, but often absent, working long hours in the family business. Kafka would later write that he lived in his own home more like a stranger than a son. One childhood memory became emblematic. As a small boy, he cried at night for water. His father, irritated, carried him out onto the balcony and left him there briefly as punishment. He later described himself in that moment as a mere nothing. Years later, in works like The Trial, a man wakes up accused by an invisible authority that never explains the charge. In The Metamorphosis, a son awakens transformed into something monstrous and immediately becomes a burden to his family. These are not random nightmares. They are emotional translations of a childhood spent under judgment without clarity. Kafka once wrote a long, unsent document known as Letter to His Father, a text exceeding 100 pages. It was not simply a complaint. It was an attempt to understand the structure of fear that had shaped him. But by the time he reached adolescence, he had already internalized a sense of being watched and measured. He performed well academically, yet privately. He felt incapable and exposed. Achievement did not silence the inner verdict. At 12, he began aspiring to write. Late at night, after the household quieted, he read intensely and retreated into imagination. And this meant that to him writing was not ambition, it was refuge. Childhood gave Kafka the feeling of being judged. By adulthood, that feeling matured into an axiom. After finishing school, Franz Kafka enrolled at the German University in Prague. He initially explored chemistry and German studies, but ultimately chose law. And no, it was not a romantic decision. He made that decision because law satisfied his father. The discipline trained him in procedures, statutes, hierarchies, and the cold language of regulation. He earned his doctorate in law in 1906, then completed a year of unpaid legal service before entering professional life. By 1908, he secured a position at the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute for the Kingdom of Bohemia. On paper, it was stable employment. In practice, it was a daily immersion in impersonal systems. Kafka's job required him to assess industrial injury claims, evaluate workplace hazards, and draft reports on factory accidents. He studied machinery, calculated risk, and wrote in the sterile vocabulary of liability and compensation. His reports were precise and competent. Every day he watched how individuals were reduced to case files. A crushed limb became documentation. A dead worker became a statistic. Suffering entered a bureaucratic pipeline. The irony is sharp. During daylight hours, Kafka participated in a system that translated human pain into forms and categories. At night, he wrote stories where human beings were swallowed by invisible institutions that would not explain themselves. In the castle, a land surveyor named K struggles to gain access to an authority that governs a village from behind layers of intermediaries. It reads less like fantasy and more like a psychological exaggeration of administrative life. Kafka often wrote deep into the night after exhausting workdays. Sleep was sacrificed, and he described his existence as divided, the external self functioning competently in office routines, and the internal self desperate to write. Having been relentlessly self-critical, Kafka burned drafts and dismissed completed stories as inadequate. Even after finishing major works, he hesitated to publish them widely. Then came illness. In 1917, Kafka was diagnosed with tuberculosis. Blood in his sputum confirmed what exhaustion had long foreshadowed. The disease would shadow him for the remaining 7 years of his life. If work exposed Kafka to institutional authority, intimacy exposed him to something even more terrifying: emotional vulnerability. Kafka fell in love more than once, most famously with Felice Bauer. Their relationship began in 1912 and unfolded largely through letters, hundreds of them. The correspondence is intense, analytical, and obsessive. He dissected his own feelings with surgical precision, alternating between longing and doubt. He proposed marriage and just as quickly withdrew them. Engagements were arranged and broken, just as plans were made and dissolved. The only thing that was consistent was the pattern. Marriage represented warmth and companionship. However, it also represented absorption, responsibility, and the possibility of failing another human being the way he believed he had failed his father. He also feared that domestic life would extinguish his writing. His diaries reveal deep anxiety about sexuality. He occasionally visited brothels, then recorded feelings of shame and detachment. For Kafka, physical intimacy did not bring ease. In fact, it only intensified his sense of division between body and mind. In The Metamorphosis, Gregor Samsa awakens transformed into an insect. The horror of the story is not merely the transformation. Throughout the story, the main concern was not finding a way to be human again. The primary concern and absolute horror was actually quite human. It was finding a way to get to work and provide for his family. This is a much more encompassing horror than becoming a monstrous insect, because the work already reduces you to becoming an insect. The real horror is not being able to provide for the family. Despite the family's reaction to what he's become, despite his family seeing him as a burden, despite his family seeing him as an embarrassment, and despite his family seeing him as an inconvenience. This narrative reflects Kafka's persistent fear that his own fragility, illness, and obsessive inwardness made him unworthy of ordinary human bonds. However, he later formed a relationship with Dora Diamant near the end of his life, but the tuberculosis had already spread to his larynx, making swallowing agonizing. In his final months, even eating became painful. Kafka once described writing as a form of prayer, but also as a form of self-exposure so intense it bordered on annihilation. The tragedy is not that he failed at love. It is that he experienced love as another courtroom, another space where he might be declared guilty without knowing the charge. By the early 1920s, Kafka's world had narrowed to illness, quiet companionship, and unfinished manuscripts. Tuberculosis had advanced, and he spent time in sanatoriums, drifting between fragile improvement and inevitable decline. Yet even as his body weakened, his instinct for self-erasure remained intact. Franz Kafka left explicit instructions to his closest friend, Max Brod, saying, "Burn everything unpublished. Destroy them without reading." It was not theatrical modesty. Kafka genuinely believed his work was incomplete, insufficient, and unworthy of survival. But Brod refused. This refusal was an act of literary disobedience that altered modern culture. After Kafka's death in 1924, Brod edited and released the unfinished novels. Among them was The Trial, the story of Joseph K., arrested and prosecuted by a mysterious authority without ever learning his crime. There was The Castle, where access to power remains perpetually deferred. And there was The Metamorphosis, already published during Kafka's life, but now placed within a broader vision of alienation and absurdity. What Kafka experienced as personal inadequacy became, in hindsight, prophetic clarity. In the decades that followed, Europe would witness totalitarian regimes, secret police, arbitrary arrests, and vast bureaucratic systems that reduced individuals to files and numbers. Readers began to see in Kafka not neurosis, but foresight. His fictional courts and castles looked disturbingly familiar. The adjective Kafkaesque entered language to describe situations where individuals confront opaque power structures that offer no explanation and no exit. The attempt to, at the very least, invoke a sense of harmony amidst the all-encompassing tension resulting from a time-sensitive futility. And just like that, Brod, having betrayed Kafka's last wish, etched him in literary lore. Kafka's enduring insight is not simply that bureaucracy is frustrating or that life is absurd. It is that modern existence often feels like standing before a tribunal amidst a pending charge. And yet, we wake up already accused. Guilty until proven innocent. We search for the rule we have broken. We defend ourselves against judgments we cannot fully see. Kafka did not invent the feeling. He articulated it flawlessly. A century later, and centuries to come, we stand in trial awaiting both a verdict and a charge.